Welcome to the video for lab number 2. This lab is called Body Regions and Major Body Cavities. So last time we talked, we went over things like anatomical position and directional terms. You can obviously tell this guy here is in anatomical position on the picture labeled A. He's actually not in anatomical position on the picture labeled B. Can you figure out why that is? Take a look at that picture really close and see if you can figure out why he's not in anatomical position in picture B. And by the way, this is the same picture that's found on page 12 of your lab manual. So you can look at it if you like. And what we're doing first is we're going to look at some body regions. It's important to know body regions so we can be specific when we're talking about the location of things and where they sit relative to one another. You've probably heard of a lot of these regional terms. Some of them might be new to you. What we're going to do is kind of zip through them sort of quickly. Okay? We're going to start with the region around the eye, which is orbital. And we get our cheek, just inferior to that. The cheek region is the buccal region. The mouth is the oral region. The neck is the cervical region. And that'd be in the front and the back, both anterior and posterior. The shoulder region is the deltoid. And again, front and back. The armpit is the axillary region. And then the arm itself. And by the arm, what we're referring to here is basically past the shoulder to the elbow. That's your arm. That's the brachial region. And then the pit in the front of your elbow, where blood might be taken or where a stethoscope bell will be put during a blood pressure measurement, that is the antecubital region. If we jump down, we got digital in the fingers. If we go back up, we got the chest. That's going to be the pectoral region. And just medial to it is the sternal region. Then inferior to those guys, we've got the abdominal region. And right in the center there, belly button, navel area, is the umbilical region. If we go to just above the genitalia, we're going to have the pubic region. And just lateral to that, we've got the inguinal region. Think about the groin there. Then we got the thigh. Thigh is femoral. The kneecap region is patellar. If we jump down, finishing out this picture, we've got digital down at the bottom here. All right, let's work our way back up. If we have the bottom of the feet here, this guy is standing on his tiptoes. The bottom of the feet is the plantar region. The back of the knee is the popliteal region. The region of the lower back just above the gluteal cleft is the sacral region. Then the lower back area right above your waist is the lumbar region. And if we go all the way up, we have one more here, back of the head. Back of the head is occipital. Now you may have noticed there's a bunch of these that are associated with bones. Patellar, femoral, sternal. Those are all associated with bones. Lumbar, sacral, occipital as well. Now you have to know these regions, plus be able to talk about how they relate to one another. For example, popliteal is posterior to patellar. Patellar is proximal to digital. So we can kind of kill two birds with one stone right there, quiz you on both the regions and the directional terms. All right, cool. That is one of the things we needed to do. Go over those body regions. Now what we need to do is go over the body cavities. There are two major cavities in your body, one in the front and one in the back. And by the way, I'm on page 15 of the lab manual. That's where this picture comes from. Now, the cavity in the back, which is up here in the head and running all the way down here, that is called the dorsal body cavity. What else could you call it? Because we're bipeds, we could also call it the posterior body cavity. Now, this dorsal body cavity is one continuous part, but it is functionally separated into two regions. There's the skull part where your brain is. That's the cranial cavity. Then there's the part within your vertebrae, and it's the vertebral cavity where, of course, you'd find your spinal cord. So that's the posterior or dorsal body cavity. Now, the anterior body cavity or ventral body cavity, this whole big thing right here. Now, it is actually separated by a muscular partition right there. That muscular partition is called the diaphragm. That muscular partition right there is a diaphragm, big muscle that you use probably about 12 to 15 times per minute every time you breathe in. So there is the diaphragm right there. Superior to the diaphragm, we have a cavity in the thorax, so it's called your thoracic cavity. It's going to contain your heart, your lungs, your esophagus, your trachea, a lot of major organs in there. Inferior to that diaphragm, we have the abdominopelvic cavity. And that is one continuous cavity, but we do separate it into a pelvic cavity in the inferior-most part and abdominal cavity above that. If you think about those hip bones, think about your hip bones on the side there, that marks that division between those two cavities. Abdominal is going to have things like your stomach, your liver, your gallbladder, your pancreas, your spleen, your kidneys, your small intestine, your large intestine. Pelvic will have your urinary bladder, your rectum, uterus, fallopian tubes, ovaries, all of those. Now, do notice how much more protection, how much more bony protection the dorsal cavity has compared to the ventral cavity. Now, in the ventral cavity, the thoracic is much more protected than the abdominopelvic. So different cavities, different degrees of bony protection. All right. If we take another look from the front now, we can still see some of the same cavities we saw before. I see the cranial cavity up here. I got the vertebral cavity right there, running inferior to it. And they kind of disappear because I can see the ventral cavities in the front now. So here is that diaphragm right there. There's that diaphragm. And when we're above the diaphragm, so this whole region, I should switch colors, shouldn't I? There we go. This whole region up here is going to be the thoracic cavity. Whole thing up here is the thoracic cavity. And we're going to expand upon it a little more in a second. Inferior to the diaphragm, we've got the abdominopelvic cavity. All right, we know abdominopelvic is divided into a superior abdominal and inferior pelvic part. What we're about to see is how the thoracic cavity is divvied up. So let's take a look at that. Okay, if you think about the major occupants of the thoracic cavity, what's taking up most of the space there is going to be a lung on each side, okay? So on each side of the thoracic cavity, there is going to be a lung. And the lung is associated with a cavity called the pleural cavity. Each lung has an associated pleural cavity. Now, I'm using the word associated there on purpose because the lung isn't actually in the pleural cavity. Okay, we'll see why in a second. It's like the pleural cavity is adjacent to the lung, okay? It kind of surrounds the lung, in fact, but the lung isn't in it. That might be it sounds kind of contradictory, but it's not. Anyway, in our thoracic cavity, we have a pleural cavity on each side associated with each lung. So a right pleural cavity and a left pleural cavity. Also, there is a big region in the middle of the thoracic cavity a big region in between the lungs. And that big region in between the lungs, so let's mark it out. I know it's labeled, but let's draw it out again. That big region right in there, dun, 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 kind of looks like a flask or a vase. That big region is the mediastinum. In the middle, behind the sternum, is the mediastinum. And you're going to find your heart in there. You're going to find your trachea, your esophagus, major blood vessels, all good stuff. Now, we find the heart in the mediastinum. Okay, so there is a cavity associated with the heart. That cavity is called a pericardial cavity. The name kind of gives it away. Peri around, cardio heart. So associated with the heart, we are going to have a pericardial cavity. So, in our thoracic cavity, we've got two pleural cavities, one on each side. And in medial to them, we have a region called the mediastinum. And in that mediastinum, associated with the heart, we have a pericardial cavity. All right, obviously, we got to look at these cavities some more. Got to do it. So let's do that. All right. In this view, we can kind of review everything we've seen so far. Let's start with that dorsal body cavity. Two parts to it. Cranial cavity in the skull holds the brain. Vertebral cavity within the vertebrae holds the spinal cord. These guys are very well protected. Then the front side is the ventral body cavity, separated by the good old diaphragm. Superior to the diaphragm, we got the thoracic cavity. Inferior to it, we're going to have the abdominopelvic, collectively made up of the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. Now, in the thoracic cavity, we are going to have a pleural cavity on each side, and then we're going to have a mediastinum, the whole thing here. The orange part will be the superior mediastinum. And in this green area down here demarks the pericardial cavity, which is associated with the heart. Okay. Good. Let's keep going. All right. In the dorsal cavity, we said we find the brain and spinal cord. Brain in the cranial cavity, spinal cord in the vertebral cavity. Now, all your body cavities, including these guys, are lined by membranes. The membranes in the dorsal body cavity, they are known as the meninges. You might have heard of meningitis when these meninges get inflamed. We can actually see a couple of these membranes, these meninges. Later on this semester, we'll talk more about them and label them and stuff. The meninges anchor the brain spinal cord and hold them in place. We don't want them bouncing around. All right. Let's go back to that ventral body cavity. That's what we're going to do. Okay. The ventral body cavity is also going to have membranes. The membranes in the ventral body cavity, they are called serous membranes. Every serous membrane is going to have two layers to it. All right, two layers to a serous membrane. And we're going to see some of these serous membranes, okay? The organs in the ventral body cavity, so like for example the heart. Imagine that this fist right here is the heart. Notice how this fist is punching into this balloon. The balloon's tied right there. Pretend this is a water balloon, in fact, okay? The fist is not getting wet right now. All right, it's kind of punching into the balloon, the water balloon, but it's not getting wet. Okay? The water isn't touching the actual fist. This is how ventral cavity organs sit. So the organ, like the fist, is surrounded by two layers, okay? There is an inner layer of balloon here, and there's an inner membrane. The inner membrane is called the visceral serosa. Serosa because it's a serous membrane. The word visceral means it's right next to the organ. The outer layer here, which would be against the wall of the body, I think about against the rib cage, against the sternum. That layer is called the parietal serosa. Now, as you can tell in this balloon, there is space. There is space in here. Space between the two layers. The space in there is called the serous cavity. And it is filled with fluid called serous fluid, which allows for the organ to movement. Think about the beating action of the heart. The heart fills up, swells, then contracts, gets a little smaller. It moves. We need some lubrication for that movement. Okay, let's reiterate. Ventral body cavity, that's where we are. So front body cavity. Think about thoracic cavity, for example. Organs in the ventral body cavity are surrounded by a double membrane called a serous membrane. The inner layer of that double membrane is called the visceral serosa. It's right up against the organ. Then outside of it is another layer called the parietal serosa. In between is fluid, serous fluid in a serous cavity. All right, we're getting warmed up. Let's now apply this to the heart. Okay, if we look at the heart, there it is right there. This heart has been drawn to show you a double membrane around it. All right, you can see the two membranes. The inner one, the black arrow there, is the visceral serosa. Now, because it's around the heart, it's called the visceral pericardium. The red arrow is on the outer serous membrane. Because it is the outer one, it's parietal. It's the parietal pericardium. The little yellow line shows us a small space between those two layers. That's the pericardial cavity. And inside there we would find pericardial fluid for lubrication. If you ever look at a heart model like this in lab, and you actually look at these a lot when you do A&P2, you learn all these parts here, all these blood vessels. This outer layer of the heart on the heart model is actually the visceral pericardium. So the visceral pericardium is this outer layer here. This outer layer is visceral pericardium. So, two-layered membrane around the heart. Inner layer visceral pericardium, outer layer parietal pericardium. In between them, pericardial cavity contains pericardial fluid for lubrication. Okay, let's look at the lungs. There they are. There's some nice lungs. Look at these nice lungs right here. Each lung has a double membrane around it. All right, the purple line represents the inner membrane. This is the visceral serosa. It's called the visceral pleura. Okay, then the light blue line going all the way around. Each lung has one. The light blue line right against those ribs right there. That is the parietal pleura. The little space between them, really tiny space. I got my yellow lines right there. That space is the pleural cavity, one for each lung. And inside is the pleural fluid. So your lungs can expand with each inhalation and contract with each exhalation and not experience too much friction. When you look at a lung model, you will see the outer layer here. This outer layer is the visceral pleura right there. Okay, that takes care of the thoracic cavity. Let's dive down to the abdominal cavity. We're going to find a similar situation. A lot of organs here. Liver, stomach, large intestine, small intestine. A lot of organs to deal with, okay? That's going to matter. Now let's look at the liver here. The liver has a membrane directly around it, light blue. Then there's another membrane outside that, which is green here. The liver is surrounded by a visceral serosa, that's the light blue. It's called the visceral peritoneum. And you can see the stomach also has a light blue visceral peritoneum. The large intestine, light blue visceral peritoneum. Small intestine, light blue visceral peritoneum. Okay, by the way, can you figure out what kind of section we're looking at here? How was this guy sliced? See if you can figure it out. Okay, where was I? Visceral peritoneum. All the light blues are the visceral peritoneum, that inner layer, that inner membrane. Lining the abdominal wall, front, top, back, and bottom, all the way around, this green line, is the parietal peritoneum. In between them, so the spaces where I have these yellow stars, that is the peritoneal cavity. The pericardial cavity is going to contain fluid called peritoneal fluid to lubricate these organs. So if you were doing a cartwheel, these organs would slide against one another. And you want to be slippery and slidey as they do that. Now, because we have so many organs in the abdominal cavity, we got to make sure they're attached to each other and attached to the abdominal wall so they're held in place. We didn't need this in the thoracic cavity because there weren't enough organs. But here in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we do need attachments. And we see a lot of attachments. They're continuous with the visceral peritoneum. Like, for example, look at this structure linking the liver to the large intestine. It's continuous with the visceral peritoneum. Here's another one linking the diaphragm and the liver, connected to the visceral and the parietal peritoneum. Everything's connected here. Here's another one, the red one, anchors the large intestine. Purple one's anchoring the small intestine. All of these attachments, these anchors, they are known as mesenteries. They're called mesenteries. Okay, with that, let's look at another picture here. There we go. This is a section through the abdominal cavity. And what I want to point out here is these membranes again, basically. So we've removed a lot of the organs from this abdominal cavity. I got a small intestine left in there. Surrounding the small intestine right here is the visceral peritoneum. Then running from it, this double layer here, is mesentery. And then going around the abdominal wall, is the parietal peritoneum. All right. So, one last thing to talk about here. Your lab manual asks you to get some tape and a lima bean. And I don't know if you have a lima bean handy. It doesn't have to be a lima bean. But you're going to use some tape, and you're going to use whatever you want. Could be anything that's small and round. You could use a penny. You could use a button, you could use a raisin, a Skittle, whatever you have handy. What you want to do is build yourself a model of this, of the peritoneum, okay? So what they've done here is they've used, looks like they used a marble, maybe? The marble here represents an organ. Let's say the marble represents the stomach, okay? The marble represents the stomach. And there's some tape directly around that marble, directly around that stomach. That tape represents the visceral peritoneum. And then the tape goes around, and the tape is stuck to the tape. Tape is stuck to tape. That tape stuck to tape is called the mesentery. The tape stuck to the tape is called the mesentery. And then the tape is stuck to the piece of paper here. Your lab manual says to tape it in your lab manual. You don't have to do that. But this would represent, the tape on the paper would be the parietal peritoneum, and the paper itself would be the abdominal wall. So you're going to do this. You're going to take a picture of it. You're going to send me that picture. I can't wait to see it. All right, guys. That is it for this second video, this Lab 2 video. Hope it was helpful. Email me with questions. please come see me in the online office hours on Blackboard. We'll talk about it. All right. Adios. See you later. Bye.